The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Naval Base San Diego. Sarah Mitchell stood at attention with 43 other candidates, her jaw clenched tight against the cold ocean breeze. At 32 years old, she was older than most of the men surrounding her. They'd made that clear from day one. "Mitchell," barked Chief Petty Officer Harmon, his weathered face twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "Still here, I see. Thought you might have quit by now." The other trainees snickered. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her uniform still dripping from the previous exercise. She'd pushed harder than anyone that morning, swimming 1,000 meters faster than the minimum requirement. But Chief Harmon didn't see that. None of them did. Sarah had joined the Navy 15 years ago as a logistics officer. She'd been good at it, organized, reliable, respected by her teams. But something had always gnawed at her. Every day, she watched the SEAL candidates train. Every day, she wondered what it would feel like to push herself to the absolute limit, to discover what she was truly made of. At 32, with her medical discharge papers already approved for a shoulder injury, she'd made the decision that terrified her. She would attempt BUD-S training, basic underwater demolition SEAL training. Everyone thought she was crazy. Her ex-husband had laughed when she told him. Her mother had cried. Her best friend from high school had sent her a sympathy text, as if she'd announced a terminal illness. But Sarah knew something they didn't. She knew that her body had healed. She knew that her mind was stronger than any shoulder injury, and she knew that she had one chance to do this before she aged out completely. So she'd applied, she'd been medically reviewed, and against all odds she'd been accepted. The first 2 weeks of training had been a baptism by fire. The early morning runs through soft sand. The endless beach sprints with logs held overhead. The exhaustion that went so deep it became part of you, like your bones were made of exhaustion. Sarah had kept up. She hadn't quit. She hadn't even slowed down. And that was the problem. The instructors, men who had dedicated their lives to the SEAL community, seemed genuinely offended by her presence. They made jokes constantly. "Mitchell, you lost weight this week. Figured it was just your chest shrinking back to normal," one instructor had said during a particularly brutal morning evolution. The men had laughed. Sarah had kept running. But the worst part wasn't the instructors. It was the other candidates. There was a kid named Rivera, couldn't have been more than 22, with the kind of cocky confidence that only came from never having failed at anything in your life. He'd made it clear that he thought Sarah's presence was insulting to the entire program. "It's not personal, ma'am," he'd told her with a fake respectful smile. "But this is a place for warriors. Not everyone can be that." And then there was Marcus Brennan. 6'2", former college football player, every muscle packed tight under his uniform. He'd appointed himself the voice of the others, the one who'd say the things everyone was thinking. "You ever notice how she moves?" he'd said loud enough for Sarah to hear during an equipment check. "Like she's got something to prove, like she's got something to make up for." Sarah had wanted to punch him. Instead, she'd smiled and kept working. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now they were entering the third phase of training, the phase everyone feared, the phase that separated the serious from the delusional. Drown-proofing. Sarah had trained for this moment obsessively. She'd spent hours in the small community pool near her apartment in the quiet suburb of Coronado. She'd studied the technique. She'd practiced holding her breath. She'd meditated on what it would feel like to have her hands and feet bound while treading water. The point of drown-proofing wasn't to teach you to escape from actual bonds. It was to teach you something deeper. It was to teach your mind that panic was a choice. That the moment before you think you'll drown is actually the moment when you're most alive. That the human body can do extraordinary things when the human mind tells it to. Sarah understood this intuitively in a way that many of the younger candidates didn't. She'd spent 15 years managing logistics for the Navy, which meant she'd spent 15 years learning how to handle impossible situations with grace. How to solve problems when solutions seemed impossible. How to keep going when everyone else had given up. She was ready, but she hadn't counted on Chief Harmon. The ocean was cold that morning. Not just cold in the way that made your muscles tighten, but cold in a way that seemed to steal the very thoughts from your head. They were standing waist-deep in the water, a line of trainees all waiting their turn. One by one, they waded out to where Chief Harmon and 2 other instructors stood with hands ready. One by one, the candidates' hands were tied behind their backs with a soft rope. Their feet were bound together at the ankles. Then they had to prove they could tread water, surface dive, and stay calm. Most of them did fine. The young men with their quick reflexes and powerful legs managed it. But there was a moment, Sarah noticed, when each of them felt the first whisper of panic. That moment when the bound hands didn't work the way they expected, when the feet tangled and wouldn't respond. Then it was Sarah's turn. She waded out calmly, the cold water rising to her chest. She could feel the weight of 43 sets of eyes on her back, could feel the energy of disbelief, skepticism, and barely suppressed mockery. "Mitchell," Chief Harmon said, his voice carrying across the water. "You sure about this? No shame in recycling back to a support role." It was a gift, really. He was giving her an out, a way to walk away without failing. Sarah met his eyes. "I'm sure, Chief." She could see him exchange a glance with the other instructors. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face. It wasn't a kind smile. "All right then, let's tie you up." The rope felt rough against her wrists as they secured her hands behind her back. The knot was tight, but not painfully so. She'd practiced this exact scenario 47 times in the community pool, timing herself, checking her breathing pattern, making sure her body knew what to do even when her mind was screaming. Her feet came together, the rope binding her ankles. Now she was suspended in the cold water with no limbs to speak of, no hands to paddle, no feet to kick. Just her core, just her will. "All right," Chief Harmon said. "Surface dive, show us what you've got." Sarah took a deep breath, filled her lungs with air. Then she tilted forward, letting her body rotate downward. The rope burned slightly against her wrists and ankles as she went down. The water was murky, cold, dark. There was no light down here. There was no way to see. There was only the feeling of pressure on all sides and the absolute knowledge that she had only one way back to the surface. Her core muscles engaged. The same muscles that had held her through hundreds of hours of training. The same muscles that had carried her through heartbreak, disappointment, and 1,000 moments when she'd wanted to quit but didn't. She pushed upward with everything she had. Her core contracted. Her legs kicked, bound together but still powerful. Her arms, tied behind her back, found a way to help to contribute some small amount of momentum. Her head broke the surface. She gasped in air, immediate, glorious, precious air, but she couldn't smile, couldn't celebrate, because now came the hard part. She had to stay there, floating, treading water with her legs bound together and her hands useless. Had to prove that she could do this not just once, but repeatedly, that she could surface dive again, and again. 10 times, Chief Harmon had said, 10 successful cycles. Sarah began the second dive. It was harder this time. Her lungs were full of the cold ocean. Her legs were beginning to feel the strain. Her core muscles were starting to realize this wasn't a one-time effort. This was endurance. She surfaced on the second dive. Third, fourth, fifth. By the fifth dive, her vision was starting to get slightly fuzzy. Her body was asking her mind whether this was really necessary, whether she really had something to prove. The answer, of course, was yes. Sixth, seventh. She could hear muffled laughter from the beach. Could hear Rivera's voice saying something she couldn't quite make out, followed by general male snickering. Eighth dive was the hardest. The psychological wall. The moment when the body genuinely didn't believe it could do another one, when every cell was screaming to stop. Sarah went deeper on the ninth dive than she had on any of the others. Deeper than the instructors probably expected. Deeper than was strictly necessary. But she needed to prove something, and the only way to prove it was to go past the place where it was easy. To go to the place where it was hard. She surfaced with a gasp that was almost a sob. One more, just one more. The 10th dive was a gift, because by this point her mind had separated from her body. She was no longer a woman treading water in the cold Pacific Ocean. She was a force, a will, a decision made manifest in human form. When she surfaced the 10th time, Chief Harmon was there with the scissors to cut the rope. She waded out of the water on shaky legs. Her heart was pounding. Her body was shaking with cold and exhaustion. Her mind was clear in the way it only gets clear after you've pushed it to the very edge. As she walked past the other trainees, dripping and shaking, she could feel the energy shift. Some of the mockery was still there, but something else had appeared. Something that looked a lot like respect. But Marcus Brennan wasn't looking at her with respect. He was looking at her with something worse. He was looking at her with fear. Because now everyone on that beach knew that Sarah Mitchell wasn't going anywhere. She was a SEAL in training, and she'd just proven she had what it took. The following week brought a strange shift in the training dynamics. Sarah had expected the mockery to ease up after drown-proofing. Instead, it seemed to intensify in ways that were harder to pin down. She'd pass by a group of instructors, and they'd go quiet. She'd arrive at the beach for early morning PT, and somehow, her name would be missing from the assignment board. She'd complete an exercise and be told to redo it because she'd done it wrong, even though she'd followed the exact same procedure as the men who'd gone before her. It was subtle, deniable, but it was definitely happening. Sarah had grown up as the daughter of a military father and a mother who worked in civil rights law. She recognized systemic unfairness when she saw it. She understood how it worked, how good people could be part of a bad system without even realizing they were doing anything wrong, how tradition could be confused with truth, how the way things had always been done could become invisible, so embedded that people stopped seeing it as a choice and started seeing it as law. But recognizing it and surviving it were two different things. 3 weeks into Phase 3 of training, something happened that made everything worse. Sarah was getting ready for the day in the women's temporary quarters, a small barracks room she shared with Lieutenant Jenny Torres, an Army officer who'd somehow been placed in the Navy training program and who'd become Sarah's only real friend in the entire compound. "You see the new training schedule?" Jenny asked, sitting on the edge of her cot with a worried expression. Sarah shook her head. She hadn't checked her messages yet. "Check your email," Jenny said quietly. Sarah pulled out her phone. There was an official memo from the training command. All candidates would be divided into teams for the next phase of training. These teams would remain locked in for 8 weeks. Teams would be graded as units. Individual performance mattered less than team performance. Sarah's team assignment made her stomach drop. She'd been placed with Marcus Brennan, Rivera, 3 other men who'd made it abundantly clear they thought she didn't belong, and one nice kid named Thomas Jefferson, probably the most decent of the bunch, but someone who was still socially dependent on the others. "It's intentional," Jenny whispered. "They're putting you with people who hate you." "Maybe," Sarah said quietly, "or maybe it's just how it worked out." But they both knew better. In the military, nothing just worked out. Every decision was made by someone, and every decision meant something. That evening, Sarah went for a run. Not her training run, her thinking run. 3 miles through the Coronado neighborhood, past the small homes and quiet streets where normal people lived normal lives. She ran past a little park where children played, unaware that the world was full of small injustices and large ones. By the time she finished, she'd made a decision. She would keep going exactly as she had been. She would complete every exercise perfectly. She would be the best team member those men had ever seen, and she would document everything. That night, she bought a small notebook, the kind that was too small to be obvious, something she could keep in her pocket and write in during breaks. She started writing down dates, times, incidents, and witnesses. She wasn't going to be a victim of a conspiracy, but she was going to be a witness to it. Over the next 4 weeks, the documentation filled up. Week 1, told to repeat ocean navigation exercise, did exactly what other candidates had done, only I was told to do it again. Brennan and Rivera watched and laughed. Week 2, team exercises assigned. My team was given equipment that was slightly broken. One of our boats had a crack in the hull. When I pointed it out, I was told I was being a complainer. Week 3, during underwater demolition exercise, the safety diver assigned to my team was late getting into the water. Exercise was delayed for everyone. My team was charged with time violations. Others were not. Week 4, failed 3 of us on weapons assembly. I assembled in 47 seconds. Thomas Jefferson assembled in 52 seconds. We both failed. Rivera assembled in 59 seconds. He passed. When I asked why, I was told that my technique was unacceptable. Sarah's notebook became her evidence. But more than that, it became her proof of sanity. Every time she wondered if she was paranoid, if she was being too sensitive, if she was reading too much into random incidents, she'd open that notebook and see the pattern clearly laid out. This wasn't about her being a woman. Not exactly. It was about something deeper. It was about a system that had been created to exclude people like her, and when that system failed to exclude her, the people running it were fighting to reinstate that exclusion. She couldn't beat them at their own game, so she was going to play a different game. She was going to be perfect. Not perfect like a woman trying to prove herself, perfect like a SEAL because that's what she was becoming. In the fourth week, something unexpected happened. The commanding officer of the training base, Captain Andrew Whitmore, showed up at an evening exercise. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with the kind of posture and presence that made everyone around him stand straighter. Sarah hadn't given much thought to the command structure above her. She'd been focused on surviving the day-to-day training. But watching Captain Whitmore observe the exercises, she had a strange feeling. He was watching her, not in the mocking way the instructors did, but in the way someone watches when they're genuinely trying to understand something. After the exercise was over, he called for everyone to gather. "Good work today," he said, which was the kind of generic compliment that military commanders gave. But then he added, "I'll be observing training more regularly. I want to see how the candidates are developing." Sarah didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when she was in the women's quarters, Jenny grabbed her arm. "That's not normal," Jenny whispered. "Captain Whitmore doesn't do observation visits. He's an administrator. He stays in his office." "Why would he start now?" Sarah asked. "Because someone asked him to," Jenny said. "Sarah, someone knows what's happening." Sarah's heart rate picked up. If someone in the command structure knew about the unfair treatment, that meant there was hope. That meant there was a possibility she didn't have to fight this battle alone. But it also meant the stakes were getting higher, because now there were people watching, and people who were watching would eventually have to choose sides. Over the next 2 weeks, Captain Whitmore appeared at every training exercise. He took notes. He talked to candidates individually. Once, Sarah caught him reviewing footage of one of her dives on his tablet. The other instructors seemed to notice his presence too. There was a visible tension in the air. Exercises became slightly more fair. The obviously impossible standards seemed to relax just a fraction. Sarah knew what was happening. Someone was applying pressure from above. Someone with authority was pushing back against the system. But she had no idea who. And she had no idea if they were strong enough to actually change anything. The 8-week team phase culminated in what was called the capstone exercise. This was a 72-hour endurance test where teams would be taken to a remote location and asked to complete a series of physically and mentally demanding objectives. No food, limited water, sleep deprivation, cold. The whole experience was designed to push a team to the breaking point and see if they could work together under extreme stress. Sarah's team had been deteriorating over the 8 weeks, not because they were failing exercises. They weren't. Despite the inherent unfairness, Sarah's team had actually been performing near the top of all the training groups, but the internal conflict had been building. Marcus Brennan had finally stopped pretending to be professional. 2 weeks before the capstone, during a joint equipment maintenance session, he'd said something quietly enough that only Sarah could hear. "You're going to fail out during capstone. We all know it. You're going to freeze, panic, and quit, and then everything can go back to normal." Sarah had just smiled and kept polishing her rifle. But the comment had planted a seed, because Brennan believed she would fail, which meant he was planning for that failure, which meant he probably had discussed it with others, which meant Sarah was no longer fighting against random unfairness. She was fighting against an active conspiracy. The morning of the capstone arrived gray and cold. Sarah's team was transported by helicopter to a remote location in the mountains northeast of San Diego. They were dropped off with minimal gear and a set of objectives that seemed designed specifically to be impossible. First objective, climb 8,000 feet of elevation gain. Second objective, navigate to 3 separate waypoints using only a map and compass. Third objective, construct a raft capable of carrying all 5 team members across a river. Fourth objective, get from the river back to base camp, 15 miles away in under 6 hours. No food, water stops at designated checkpoints that might not exist. Sleep deprivation starting immediately because the first 2 objectives would take all night. Sarah had trained for this, not the specific exercises, but the mental state required to survive them. She'd been running 40 miles a week for 2 months. She'd been doing visualization training where she'd imagine the worst-case scenarios and run through them mentally. She'd been meditating on the idea that exhaustion wasn't a reason to quit. It was just information your body was giving you. They started climbing at 6 a.m. By noon, Thomas Jefferson was struggling. His breathing was labored, his pace had slowed, and his face had taken on the gray pallor of someone whose body was starting to shut down. "We need to rest," Marcus said. "It wasn't a request, it was a command." "We'll rest when we reach the waypoint," Sarah said. "We need to maintain pace or we'll miss the first checkpoint." "She's trying to kill us," Rivera said bitterly. "Look at him, he's dying." Sarah wasn't an idiot. She could see that Thomas was struggling. But she also understood that stopping to rest in the middle of a mountain climb wasn't the right tactical choice. They'd lose momentum, get cold, and lose a minimum of 2 hours. 10-minute rest at the top of this ridge, Sarah said. Then we push for the checkpoint. Marcus looked at her with open hatred. "You don't get to give orders." "Then give the order," Sarah said. "We're going to rest," Rivera said, and just like that the team had fractured. Thomas sat down on a rock, his head between his knees. Rivera and Brennan sat down too. The fourth team member, a quiet kid named Jackson, looked torn but eventually sat. Sarah remained standing. For the next hour, she watched her team slowly recover. She said nothing. She didn't lecture them or tell them they were making a mistake. She just stood there, keeping herself warm by moving in place, waiting. When they resumed, they moved faster. But there was an anger in the group now, an understanding that Sarah wasn't one of them, that she was operating according to a different logic, and that logic was winning. The night was brutal. They reached the first waypoint at midnight. The second waypoint was located in a ravine that required some technical rock climbing. Sarah led the way, because of course she did, and because she was the only one who'd taken technical climbing courses outside the standard training. By the time they reached the second waypoint at dawn, everyone except Sarah was hallucinating from exhaustion. Thomas was seeing things that weren't there. He kept pointing at shadows and asking what they were. Rivera was moving slowly, robotically, responding to commands but not initiating thought. Jackson was crying silently. Marcus was moving on pure adrenaline and hatred. Sarah was the only one thinking clearly. They had to build a raft. There were materials near the river: logs, rope, some plastic sheeting. The raft had to be constructed according to specifications and tested to carry all 5 of them across a 40-foot-wide river. Sarah had taken some elementary engineering courses. She understood load distribution and buoyancy. She could see how to build the raft. "I'll direct the construction," she said. "No," Marcus said immediately. "Jackson and I will figure it out." They worked for hours while Sarah, Thomas, and Rivera sat nearby, too exhausted to help. Their raft was a disaster. When they tested it, it tilted dangerously under the weight of 3 people. There was no way it would hold all 5. "Your turn," Marcus said bitterly. Sarah stood, every muscle screaming in protest, and started directing a rebuild. She repositioned the logs. She retied the rope using a better weight distribution system. She created flotation using the plastic sheeting in a way that Brennan's design had missed. The rebuilt raft held all 5 of them. The river crossing should have been their victory moment, but Marcus was beyond accepting victory that Sarah had made possible. He was too deep in his own story about what was unfair. The final leg was the 15-mile hike back to base camp. They were running out of time. They had 4 hours to make it. Sarah calculated the pace silently. 15 miles in 4 hours meant they needed to maintain a 4 miles per hour pace. That was jogging pace, basically non-stop, for men who'd had no food and minimal sleep. She knew it was possible. She'd done longer on harder conditions. She also knew it would require everyone to push past the point where their minds were telling them to quit. "We go now," she said. "We jog at steady pace. We don't stop except to breathe. We can make it if we move together." Thomas, Rivera, and Jackson started moving. They were too exhausted to argue. Marcus just stood there. "Come on," Sarah said. "I'm not following your orders," Marcus said. "I'm done. You're not the leader of this team." Sarah's mind went very quiet. She could see the path ahead. She could see the finish line, so close she could almost touch it. She could see her whole future. If they made it, she'd be a SEAL. If they didn't, the story Brennan had built in his mind would have won. She made a decision. She looked at Marcus directly. "I'm not asking you to follow my orders," she said. "I'm asking you to follow the objective. The objective is to get this team back to base camp in 4 hours. We do that together or we fail together. But you're not going to be the reason we fail." Then she turned and started jogging. Behind her she heard footsteps. Thomas, Rivera, Jackson, and after a moment of stunned silence, Marcus. They made it back in 3 hours and 42 minutes. As they collapsed on the ground in front of the base camp, an instructor approached with a timer. Capstone complete. Team Mitchell, your overall performance puts you in the top 3 teams. Team Mitchell, that was what he called them, not Brennan's team, not Rivera's team, but Mitchell's team. Marcus heard it too, and Sarah saw something flash across his face that looked a lot like the moment when someone realizes they've lost a battle they didn't even know they were fighting. Sarah was barely conscious when Captain Whitmore appeared. He looked at each member of the team, his gaze lingering on Sarah. And then he did something that seemed unusual. He helped her to her feet. "Good work, Mitchell," he said. "Rest, we need to talk tomorrow." That night, Sarah slept the sleep of the truly exhausted. No dreams, no consciousness, just darkness and recovery. When she woke the next morning, she had no idea that everything was about to change. She'd showered, eaten real food, and slept 12 hours, so she was approaching something close to human again. But exhaustion still clung to her like a second skin, the kind of deep exhaustion that makes you want to sleep for a week. The captain's office was exactly what Sarah would have expected. Clean, organized, decorated with commendations, photographs of ships, and a window that overlooked the training grounds. Captain Whitmore was standing at that window when she entered. He turned slowly, as if he'd been watching the exercises below and thinking about something serious. "Sit down, Mitchell," he said. Sarah sat. She had no idea what this was about. She hoped it wasn't something bad. After the capstone, she'd felt like maybe the worst was over. But she'd learned in her 32 years that hope was often premature. "I'm going to ask you a question," Captain Whitmore said, "and I want you to answer me honestly. Have you been treated fairly during your time in Bud S training?" It was such a direct question that Sarah nearly didn't know how to respond. She'd expected something vague, something that could be interpreted multiple ways. Not this. "No, sir," she said quietly. Captain Whitmore nodded, as if he'd already known the answer. "Tell me." So Sarah told him. She pulled out the small notebook she'd been keeping and walked him through 4 weeks of documentation. Unfair standards, equipment that had been deliberately damaged, exercises that other teams hadn't been asked to do, the constant undertone of disrespect and mockery. Captain Whitmore listened without interrupting. His expression remained neutral. When she finished, he took the notebook and read through it carefully. "This is good work," he said finally. "Detailed, dated, specific. This is the kind of evidence that actually means something." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "I need to tell you something," the captain said, sitting back in his chair. "I was brought into this situation because Admiral Patricia Chen, she's the regional commander, I report to her, received a call from the Naval Legal Department. Someone had filed a formal complaint about the treatment of female candidates in the Bud S program. The complaint didn't name you specifically, but when I read it, I recognized the pattern immediately." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Someone had filed a complaint on her behalf. But who? The only people who knew about the unfair treatment were her, Jenny, and the people causing the unfairness. "Who filed it?" she asked. "I can't tell you that yet," Captain Whitmore said. "But what I can tell you is that Admiral Chen ordered me to begin an investigation. I've been documenting everything for the past 3 weeks. Your notebook here confirms what I've already discovered." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Captain Whitmore said, "we move forward with the graduation phase. You'll finish training, you'll earn your trident, and then we have a reckoning." Sarah left his office in a kind of daze. She'd gone so long believing that she was fighting this battle alone, that every unfair assignment and every mocking comment was something she had to accept as part of the process. Learning that someone had filed a complaint, that someone had advocated for her, that there were people in positions of power who were willing to push back against the system. It was almost too much. The final 2 weeks of training passed in a blur of careful normalcy. The instructors seemed to know that Captain Whitmore was watching closely, so the worst of the overt unfairness disappeared. Exercises were assigned fairly. Standards were applied equally. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly the system was functioning the way it was supposed to. Sarah passed all her tests. She qualified on every exercise. She proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that she was as much a SEAL as any man who'd gone through the program. On graduation day, there were families everywhere. Mothers and fathers, wives and children, best friends and lovers. Everyone had come to watch the next generation of America's elite warriors receive their tridents. Sarah's mother was there, tears streaming down her face. Her ex-husband was there too, having showed up at the last minute looking at Sarah with something like awe. Jenny was there, holding a sign that said, "Welcome to the team, Sarah." The ceremony was dignified and meaningful. One by one, candidates came forward to have their tridents pinned on their uniforms. As each name was called, the crowd cheered. "Mitchell," the announcer called. Sarah walked forward. She shook hands with Captain Whitmore, who pinned the trident to her uniform with a quiet word. "You did it." She was officially a Navy SEAL. But the moment of celebration was cut short. Instead of the ceremony ending, Admiral Patricia Chen, a woman Sarah had never met, with salt and pepper hair and the bearing of someone who'd fought hard for every inch of authority she possessed, walked to the podium. "Before we conclude," the Admiral said, "I need to address something. There has been a formal investigation into the treatment of candidates during this training cycle. The investigation revealed a pattern of systemic bias, unfair standards, and unequal treatment. This is not acceptable. This is not who we are." The crowd went silent. Specific individuals in leadership positions have been found to have engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Harmon has been relieved of his command and recommended for discharge. Instructor Rivera Sr. has been demoted and reassigned. All candidates who received unequal treatment have been formally exonerated and their records cleared. We will do better. Sarah's heart was pounding. This was happening. This was actually happening. But the Admiral wasn't finished. "There is also something else," Admiral Chen said. "There is a candidate in this graduating class who demonstrated not just the physical and mental capability to be a SEAL, but something else. She demonstrated the moral courage to endure unfair treatment, document it carefully, and then continue performing at the highest level despite that unfairness. That is the definition of a SEAL." She looked directly at Sarah. "Sarah Mitchell, please come back to the podium." Sarah's legs felt strange as she walked. This wasn't supposed to be her moment. This was supposed to be everyone's moment, but there was no refusing the Admiral. "Based on my review of the investigation and my assessment of this training cycle," Admiral Chen said, "I am awarding you the meritorious promotion. You will immediately be promoted to Lieutenant Commander, effective today. You will serve as the liaison officer between the SEALs and the Naval Legal Department, helping to ensure that what happened to you never happens to another candidate again." The crowd erupted. Sarah's mother was standing, screaming, tears flowing down her face. Jenny was jumping up and down. Even some of the other graduates were applauding. It was too much. It was too much happiness, too much vindication, too much sudden shifting from a reality where she'd been alone to a reality where she'd been seen and valued and promoted. She was shaking when she made it back to the line. That night, there was a reception. Sarah was pulled aside by officers, by admirals, by people in the command structure who wanted to congratulate her and express their outrage at what had happened. But what she really wanted was quiet. She found it at the edge of the parking lot, sitting on a bench and looking out at the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and orange. The same ocean where she'd proven to herself and everyone else what she was made of. A familiar voice interrupted her reverie. "Pretty good day, huh?" Sarah turned to see Jenny, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Sit," Jenny said, sitting beside her. "I have something to tell you." "What?" Sarah asked. "I filed the complaint," Jenny said. "That first week when they told you to redo the dive and I watched them treat you like you were crazy. I went to the legal office and filed a formal complaint about discrimination. They told me it might not go anywhere, but I had to try. I had to do something." Sarah started crying, not the exhausted tears of someone who'd been pushed to her limit, but tears of recognition, of gratitude, of the deep relief that comes from knowing you were never actually alone. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "You did the rest," Jenny said. "You kept going, you documented everything, you proved they couldn't break you. I just opened the door, you walked through it." They sat together in the fading light, 2 women watching the sun set on an ocean that had tested them both and found them worthy. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a conference room with 23 other Navy leaders, admirals, captains, and command chiefs. They were reviewing the new protocols that the Bud S program would be implementing, and Sarah was presenting the findings from the investigation. The issue, she was saying, was that many of the instructors genuinely believed they were maintaining standards when they were actually maintaining traditions. There's a difference. Standards are about capability. Traditions are about the way things have always been done. When we confuse the two, we end up excluding people not because they can't meet the standards, but because they don't fit the tradition. The room was listening intently. Some heads were nodding, some were frowning, but everyone was paying attention. Admiral Chen, sitting at the head of the table, had suggested that Sarah take on this role. "We need someone with credibility," she'd said. "Someone who's lived through the system and can speak about it from experience." Sarah had accepted the position of SEAL Command Liaison, a new role created specifically to help reform the training program and ensure that all candidates, regardless of gender or background, were treated fairly. It had been a difficult 6 months. She'd had to conduct interviews with dozens of people. Some had been genuinely remorseful about their actions. Others had been defensive. A few had been openly hostile, believing that the changes being made were destroying the integrity of the program. But there had also been surprising allies. Young instructors who had wanted to speak up about unfairness but hadn't known how. Mid-level commanders who saw the investigation as an opportunity to improve. Candidates who'd seen what had happened and were grateful that something was finally being done about it. And then there was the evidence. Sarah had compiled every documented instance of unfair treatment for the past 5 years. She'd reviewed training records, looked for patterns in who passed and who failed, analyzed the standards being applied to different candidates. The data was overwhelming. Women were being held to different standards. Minority candidates were being held to different standards. Anyone who didn't fit the standard SEAL profile was being held to different standards. But when those standards were equalized, the data showed something interesting. The pass rate for women actually increased. The pass rate for minority candidates increased, not because the training had gotten easier, but because the bar was now measuring capability, not tradition. "The changes we're implementing," Sarah continued, "are not lowering standards, they're clarifying them. Every candidate goes through the exact same physical test. Every candidate is held to the exact same underwater evaluation criteria. Every candidate has to demonstrate the same mental resilience and problem-solving capability. But we're not asking them to do it while also fighting a system that's actively working against them." She clicked to the next slide. It showed data from the training cycle she'd gone through. Her test scores alongside the test scores of male candidates who'd completed the same exercises. It was a stark comparison. Her times were faster. Her underwater skills were more advanced. Her scores on the psychological evaluation were higher. "This wasn't because I was a better candidate," Sarah said. "It was because I had something to prove. When people have to work twice as hard just to be treated as equal, they often end up being better at it than people who have had an easy path. But that's not a sustainable system. We don't want people to have to suffer in order to prove their worth. We want people to be able to achieve their best potential without that extra burden." The presentation went on for 90 minutes. Questions were asked and answered. By the end, there was general agreement that the changes being implemented were necessary and right. As people were leaving, Admiral Chen pulled Sarah aside. "You're good at this," the Admiral said. "Have you thought about staying in the Navy, making this a career?" Sarah had thought about it. In fact, she'd been thinking about it a lot. When she joined the Navy 15 years ago, she'd been running away from something. From a failed marriage, from a sense that she didn't fit anywhere, from the vague feeling that her life should mean something bigger than what it meant. She'd stayed in the Navy until her shoulder got hurt, and then she'd been ready to be done. To move on to some civilian job, to live a normal life, to stop fighting. But then she'd applied for Bud-S training, and everything had changed. "Yeah," Sarah said, "I think I have." "Good," Admiral Chen said, "because we're going to need people like you in leadership, people who have fought the system from inside it, people who understand what it means to keep going when the odds are against you." The Admiral put her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're going to do a lot of good here." That night, Sarah called her mother. "I'm staying in," she said. "I'm going to do this job for at least 2 more years, maybe longer." Her mother laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from pure joy. "I always knew you'd find your way," her mother said. "I just wasn't sure it would be as a Navy SEAL liaison." "Neither was I," Sarah admitted. In the weeks that followed, Sarah settled into her new role. She was no longer in the water. She was no longer pushing her body to the physical limit every single day. But she was still using every bit of strength she'd learned to develop, the mental toughness, the refusal to quit, the ability to stay clear-headed when emotions were running high. She worked with instructors who were struggling to let go of old traditions. She mentored new candidates who felt like outsiders. She presented research at military academies about fairness and standards. She became, in her own unexpected way, a voice for change in a system that had been resisting change for decades. 3 years later, Sarah was briefing the new commander of SEAL Team 1 on the recruitment and development strategy she'd helped create. "The numbers show that we're bringing in more qualified candidates overall," she was explaining, "because we're measuring actual capability instead of cultural fit. We're also retaining more candidates at the elite levels, which is improving the quality of the teams." The commander, a man named Thomas Voss who'd come up through the system the old way but was committed to making it better, was nodding thoughtfully. "What do you attribute the success to?" he asked. "Fair standards," Sarah said simply. "Clear expectations, and the knowledge that if you're being asked to do something, it's because it matters, not because someone's trying to prove a point." After the briefing, as Sarah was packing up her materials, she got a message on her phone. It was from Rivera, the candidate from her original training class, the one who'd mocked her and been part of the team that had tried to sabotage her success. The message said, "I heard you're speaking at the academy next month. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I was wrong. And I'm grateful that someone like you had the courage to change the system that I was benefiting from. The teams are better because you pushed back." Sarah read the message 3 times. She didn't respond immediately, but later that night, sitting in her apartment in San Diego, she typed back, "Thank you for saying that. That matters." Because it did. It mattered that people could change. It mattered that systems could be reformed. It mattered that sometimes, if you kept pushing forward when everything was telling you to quit, you could actually make a difference. Sarah looked out at the ocean from her window. The same ocean where she'd learned that the moment before you think you'll drown is the moment when you're most alive, when your mind is clearest, when you're capable of understanding the deepest truth about who you are. She'd thought that truth was about being strong enough to survive, but she'd learned something else over the past 3 years. The real strength was in the willingness to change things that weren't working, to speak up when you saw unfairness, to keep going not just for yourself, but for everyone who would come after you. Sarah Mitchell had become a SEAL, but she'd become something else too. She'd become the person who made sure that no one else would have to fight alone. And that, in the end, turned out to be the most meaningful achievement of all.